Good afternoon and welcome to this session on scientific data sharing and its impact on scientific careers and their evaluation. My name is Mogens Thomsen. I'm a medical doctor and emeritus researcher at Inserm in Toulouse. I was a scientific advisor at ESOF 2018 in Toulouse. We thank the programming committee for selecting the session for ESOF 2020. We had imagined the session as a sort of workshop, including discussions among young researchers, but COVID-19 has changed the scenario. The importance of sharing research data in the spirit of open science is widely recognized. Europe is a leader in this policy as demonstrated by Plan S and the Open Science Cloud. The international organization Research Data Alliance has such sharing of data as a priority, but still there's a long way to go. Sharing of data is not really regarded as a scientific activity and should be encouraged and rewarded more. There are also a number of technical questions that have to be solved. The management of research data is time-consuming and needs specific skills and knowledge of various programming tools. In this session, we will present an overview of the current state of establishing open science and principles and some of the technical hurdles to overcome. We intend to investigate various aspects of data sharing in scientific careers, as seen by members of Marie Curie Alumni Association and the Global Young Academy. The motto of ESOF 2018 was sharing science towards new horizons, but we did not anticipate that the new horizons should include the current COVID-19 pandemic. The moderator is Annika Thomsen, who was a champion of ESOF 2018 in Toulouse. And we have 4 excellent speakers, and we hope there will be an interesting discussion with questions from the audience. So I hand over the microphone to Anna.
Thank you very much. So I hope you can see my screen with the title of the session. Welcome to the audience. And I made a sort of subtitle, from top-down encouragement to everyday life reality, policy, actions, practices. And if we lack policy, well, there are a problem, nothing is happening. If we lack actions, obviously, it remains a dream, and practices may be improved and need to be experienced in order that the sharing of scientific data become a more reality. So the outline of this session, as I am the moderator, I want to underline that for the audience that you have a device to ask questions even while the speakers are talking. And we plan to have the answers to those questions at the end of the sort of round table. But we will look if there are questions while the session is going on, so that we do not miss any urgent question if there are. So I make this introduction. I will come back to me in a second. And then will come Robert Jan Smits, who is presently the president of Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands, and was the former general director of research and innovation in the European Commission, and a key person for the Plan S of the European Union or the European Commission. Susanna Sansoni is from the University of Oxford. She will talk after Robert Jan, and she is a key person on and very experienced in the domain of the FAIR principles, to which we will come back, and where the problem now is not so much the principle themselves, but their implementation. And then we have two persons who were or are involved in association and organization of young researchers. The Marie Curie Alumni Association, where we have the former chair here, and we also have then Koen Vermeer, who will be talking more on the view of the global young academy. So we have experienced people, active people in the domain, and the view of young researchers reported, as we cannot have the discussion together as we had anticipated. So much for the session, and we will then. I have to click to get my next slide. I don't know how to do that. Yeah. The question is, why did we propose that session? And we did that commonly between Mogens, Thompson, and me. I'm personally a medical doctor and emeritus research director in the National Center for Scientific Research in France and working in an epidemiology unit in Toulouse. And I'm also an ambassador of the Research Data Alliance and the previous ESOF 2018 champion, as was recalled before. So within this Research Data Alliance, well, I have different activities, but one of them is I'm co-chairing one interest group, this alliance that was born in 2013 and has close to 11,000 members all over the world, is working with interest group, working groups, and different groups of people with a large community-oriented attitude. So one of those groups is an interest group called SHARK. You probably will remember easily this acronym. It means Sharing Rewards and Credit. And I'm also a co-chair of the RDA COVID-19 working group, working specifically on guidelines and recommendations for sharing data in the domain of a pandemic, and we are just in the middle of it. And we issued a document endorsed by RDA by the end of June after an intense work. And this showed how important the sharing of data was, in specifically all the time, I would say, but specifically and across discipline, across countries, with all the complication of it in the context of a pandemic. We had a session this morning on this aspect, and this afternoon we are more on, well, how is that in the life of researchers? So this group, SHARK, made the observation, as many others, that despite numerous statements, active promotion, declaration, and so on, data and materials sharing according to the FAIR principle, so findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, is not the practice in most communities in reality. One major obstacle to that, and there are different, they can be technical or others, one of them is the lack of the recognition of the efforts required to make this sharing a reality. So the group aims to unpack and improving, if possible, crediting and rewarding mechanism in the data and resources sharing process. And how do we work for that? By providing a practical recommendation that would take into account as much as possible the challenges within existing academic infrastructures to try to resolve these difficulties. And I just mentioned that this group, or part of this interest group, has recently published a paper from its group in his work in the group in Data Science Journal. You have the reference here. And the title is Fairness Literacy, the Achilles heel of applying FAIR principles. And that we will come back with the speakers to that. not only principles have to exist, but they have to be known before they can be put in practice. So as Mogens said in the opening words, open science is a strong movement, and Europe has a leading role with the Plan S and Open Science Cloud and different initiatives and supporting different projects aiming at making this a reality. Of course, not only open access to publications, which is already a big achievement, but open data are promoted. And the sharing of data is actually key to the future, and we probably can discuss that. But we had this example of COVID-19, which showed vividly the importance of it. So as I explained, the Research Data Alliance has this sharing as a priority, and the interest of this organization is that it explores practical aspects across disciplines with a very much important interdisciplinarity. Of course, if you can't find the data, if they are not accessible, you can't really share and reuse. So these FAIR principles that will be presented are key to enable the sharing of scientific data. So the question of this session is, what are the consequences for careers and evaluation in a career of researchers? Of course, there is not one unique picture, but several. And I'm very happy that this panel will actually give different views from different perspectives. And I hope this will trigger a lively discussion. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Jan Smits, whom I'm very, very happy to see in this session. He is currently the president of Eindhoven University of Technology, and has entitled his talk, Open Science, Are We Walking the Talk? And this reflects, I think, the aim of that session so well that I'm not going to take more time, and I will pass the word to him right now, while I am looking for sharing his presentation.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Some 6 years ago, the European Commission organized a public consultation with the science community about the question, do you agree with us that the way we are doing science, the way we are doing research is changing big time? Next slide, please. And the answer we received, I still talk about we as if I was still in Brussels, but I've changed as answered in the meantime. But the replies that the European Commission received were numerous, a few thousand. And actually all the scientists and researchers who reacted to this consultation, they all confirmed that indeed the way we're doing research and science is changing and has changed. And when do we ask the question, and that's the next slide, what are the drivers of these changes? Why is this change happening? They mentioned very clearly, I think, first of all, the exponential growth of data, the big data, but certainly also, of course, the availability of digital technologies to mine these data. And then they say another driver which causes the way we do research to change big time is, of course, the enormous growth of the global science community, which offers enormous opportunities for cooperation. And the last driver of the change was very much seen by the demands from society for bigger transparency, quicker bang for the buck, quick solutions, respect of ethics, and also involvement in agenda setting. Next one, please. This led very, very much then to one conclusion when we asked the science community from Brussels, what is then necessary, what is needed? The answer was, we need more openness, we need more transparency, and we need much more cooperation. In other words, we need open science. What happened next, and it's the next slide, there was then a question asked, but what do you then see, science community, as advantages of having open science? And there the answers were also quite straightforward. The science community said a faster circulation of new ideas, a better return on R&I investments, mutual respect and understanding, less scientific misconduct, because if we really work together and looking over each other's shoulder more than ever before, we can avoid scientific misconduct, more transparency, things are much more open, more support and ownership in society, and probably more funding. Next one, please. Subsequently, we asked from Brussels, the science community, the question, but what should then be priorities? What do we need to do in the context of an open science agenda? What should be the main focus areas? And there you see them on the screen. The science community said, well, first of all, open access publications. We need to really go forward on that. We've been talking about it for ages. Open access data, relatively new then. We need to have more global cooperation, notably on the ground societal challenges, the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to work much more research integrity. We also need to do everything to get the citizen involved. Rewards and incentives need to be perhaps revised or revisited, and we need new metrics. And that is the next slide, led to a number of specific actions in order to move forward on these priorities. And you have them here listed on the screen. With regard to open access publications, Plan S was developed, in which I myself was directly involved. Open access data, the European Open Science Cloud was developed, where Jean-Claude Burgerman from the European Commission played a key role. I was working with him as well on this one. With regard to global cooperation, the idea was very much to make Horizon Europe open also to association to countries outside the European Union, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. With regard to research integrity, there was the action defined updating the European Code on Research Integrity to perhaps also put a notion in there like data integrity. Citizen science is to share much more best practices, because there's a lot of good practices in member states, how we can involve the citizens. Rewards and incentives, a new definition and guidelines, and the new metrics is to look for alternative indicators to measure scientific output, other than just citations and the journal impact factor. Now, if we take the next slide, what is quite obvious that if we want open science to succeed, it requires very much a cultural change. A cultural change in order to make it required, make it rewarding, make it normative, make it easy, and make it possible. So it requires a cultural change in the academic community. Next one, please. I'm going to focus in particular on two very much related parts of the open access agenda and the open access of the open science agenda and open science priorities, Plan S and the open access data, European Open Science Cloud. The next slide shows a little bit the logo of Plan S. I think most of you are familiar with it. It was also discussed in previous sessions. This is all about funding agencies signing up to Plan S, which says that if in future a scientist gets a grant from a funding agency which has signed up to Plan S, this scientist can only publish the results of the research, the publication, in an open access journal of high quality. This Plan S is at the moment widely supported, not only in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. And of course, implementation will start on the 1st of January 2021. Next one, please. But bringing it closer a little bit to the discussion we have now, I'm going to say a few words about open access data and the European Open Science Cloud. Next one, please. The European Open Science Cloud, I think, is a great initiative of the European Commission. And again, grateful to Jean-Claude Bergerman and his colleagues for having worked on that so intensively. And it's not about just a cloud where you can store data. It's about a cultural change in the science community, which starts with creating inside the science community a culture of data stewardship, whereby scientists look after their data. And it's also about funding agencies, when they give grants to scientists, making data management plans obligatory. And these data management plans have to say that data have to be fair. Subsequently, work needs to be done on European-wide repositories where data can be stored, kind of safe haven. And last but not least, as part of the European Open Science Cloud actions, there is, of course, a rewards and incentive scheme necessary. People who share the data, who look after the data, need to be rewarded for this. And that's, I think, and that's why the Open Science Cloud initiative is a holistic initiative, not just a cloud where you can store data, but creating a culture of data stewardship. Next one, please. The Royal Society has put this into a very nice document, and these slides, which I borrowed from them, they talk about a stairway to the data heaven, which starts all the way with the cultural change, sharing data, making them fair, and creating a culture in which people who share the data are rewarded. And this helps them in their scientific career. Now to end, and that's the next slide, a little few words about where do we stand with the open science agenda. I think we've made quite some progress in open access publications, notably thanks to Plan S. On research integrity, there has been a modification of the European Code on Research Ethics and Research Integrity, which is now translated at national level, which includes now the notion of data integrity. I think we still have to do a lot of work on global cooperation. During the COVID-19 crisis, we saw an enormous cooperation between the scientists from all over the world to find solutions, work on vaccines and medication. But at the same time, we also see increased nationalism in a lot of countries, which will hamper cooperation also between scientists. I think on citizen science, we have made rather good progress, but we still a long way to go. And open access data, we are indeed scratching the surface, but thanks to the European Open Science Cloud Initiative, to the RDA, we have also making some progress over there. But we still have a long way to go with regard to new rewards and incentives into the science community. Most people in academia, in universities, only make a career based on the number of publications in the so-called high-impact journals. You are not rewarded for the teaching you do. You're not rewarded for the startups or the spin-off you generate. You're not rewarded for science communication or scientific support to policymaking, and you're not rewarded for looking after your data. So we have still a long way to go. And wouldn't it be great that one day, if there's a scientific publication, the first name that is mentioned on the scientific publication is the name of the data scientist. If that happens, I think we are there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert-Jan. You really set the scene, and this last slide shows where are the hurdles we still need to come over. And I think that you also mentioned fair principles and data that have to be fair. And that's a wonderful introduction to our next speaker, who is Susanna Sansone from the University of Oxford. And she's an expert in this fair principle, fair data aspects. And I think she will help us understanding what it is, where we are, and how we go there. So Suzanne, can you maybe share your screen?
Thank you, Anne. and good afternoon, everyone. So yes, as an author of the FAIR principle, I have the pleasure to briefly introduce you what they are and also give you an overview of the landscape of the different implementation and the status of some of the activity. Obviously, I only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go into too much details. Right, so what is FAIR? FAIR is a set of principles published in 2016 that really are set to define the value of the digital resources and make sure they are fundable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, not just by human, but by machine. And the latter is essential because we are in the data science area. We need to make sure the data is not just discoverable, that's already not the trivial things, but also it's reusable at scale. By agent. Now, to make sure that you all know what FAIR is in details, this is just one slide, a very brief slide showing the principle in a nutshell. So what FAIR principles are about, it's about stressing the importance of identifying the data or the digital data set, make sure they are described with rich metadata and data standards defined by the community using common terminology, taxonomy, control vocabulary, ontology, and identifier standard are really the pillars of FAIR to ensure that machine can use and consume this data. FAIR is also about describing clearly what the provenance, what the context of a digital file that's shared, because in order to reproduce, you need to understand the context in which this data, this information has been, has resulted from. Also, FAIR is not about open data. Some data necessarily cannot be open. And FAIR, it's about defining the term of access. Data should be as open as possible, as close as necessary. So it's really important to define the type of license or the term of use. It's also important to say that FAIR is not the standard. FAIR is just a set of guiding principles. It's a continuum that will guide us to ensure the data is increasingly reusable. And it can be implemented in many ways, in different ways. And I will come back on that topics because this is important, but is also creating a lot of challenges. This slide, it's really a simplification to show how the principles have propelled the global debate around data stewardship, data management, data transparency, data reproducibility worldwide. And here I'm trying only to put logo of some of the global initiatives and reports which are really endorsing FAIR as a principle. And FAIR is becoming a global de facto standard and a norm. I also want to highlight on the top right of the slide, you can see a report from the European Commission. This is a couple of years old, but they are estimating that not having data FAIR would actually cost over 10 billion euro per year. So here there is also an economic incentive of make sure that data is fair because we fund so much the research, but we wanted the output to be available and to be reusable. And the reason why FAIR is becoming so important and somehow is giving research data management a second life, this because reproducibility is still an issue. And obviously because we are moving in the era of human-machine interaction, so we need to make data available in machine-readable manner at scale. Like you already heard from the previous speaker, from Robert Jans, that the mandate from funders is becoming stronger in terms of sharing the data, and the scholarly publishing scenario and ecosystem is changing the way we publish the data, and researchers want and need the credit for sharing the data and for sharing data of high quality. But to make data fair, to turn fair into reality, we really need a variety of stakeholders to participate, from the researcher, the librarian, the funders, the publisher, the service providers, the curators, a variety of community has to play their role. We need a lot of things. We need the tool, we need infrastructure, we need standard, the policy, the education, the training, technical change, culture change, and obviously all the motivation. You already heard this, so I'm going to be faster in this. Now, I've been working in data management for over 20 years, and before FAIR, and I was working in this field before FAIR, there were really few people interested in doing this in a professional manner, data sharing, research, data management. After FAIR, let me tell you that the road is becoming crowdier and crowdier. And now we are to the point where we have so much implementation, so many projects, so many activities that I think is a little bit chaotic, but I'm pretty sure that from chaos, orders will come. And that's important, really show how much community are raising to the challenge. I've taken this slide from colleagues of the FAIRSPARE project. It's one of the EOS projects, and I have also the pleasure to be a FAIRSPARE FAIR data champion. In their slide, they actually give you this overview of the landscape of the different groups within EOS tackling turning FAIR into reality, as well as the many projects which have been funded by a variety of programs, and especially in the EU, this one, that really focus on implementing FAIR, turning FAIR into reality. This is great, but obviously this creating challenge as well per se. The group are creating tools for assessing, for certifying data fairness, documentation and policy that help, training material, and so on and so forth. I want to focus my last 4 minutes on one project, which is called Fair Sharing, because I run that project with the community, and also because I want to highlight one of the key stakeholders in this ecosystem, which are the publisher. So very briefly, Fair Sharing, it's an informative and educational resource that describe, catalog, and register all these standards, which are essential for making data fair, the repository, which play an essential role in sharing the data, I'm talking about global repository knowledge base, as well as all the policy the funders and publishers are developing, because they are starting recommending the use of the standard, the use of the repository. So making this resource searchable, discoverable, and visible to the consumer is essential, but it's also essential to give the credit to the people that have developed these resources as well. So Fair Sharing also comes from the RDA community, because we develop an output for the RDA community and we are endorsed by them, as many as other funders. But as you can see from this slide, the majority of our adopters tend to be the publisher, which are very active in this fair space. Why are they active? Well, we are working with them because we think that publishers occupy a leverage point in the promotion of data sharing. And many of them have released open access journals, data journals, which are essential to give credit to people that create, curate, assemble data. But they also have started to occupy the fair space by also find it as a business opportunity. Some of them have released, a research data support. We can agree or disagree, but they are coming in this space and they are very active in this space. So working with them is very essential. And what we do are two things specifically through the Fair Sharing, collaboration, and community. We work with them to make sure that when they develop the data sharing policy, where they recommend standard and repository, they actually recommend the appropriate standard repository the community use, that the community believe are certified, are richer, have standards, so they have fairer data. And so they can evolve and update their data policy. And we also do something else. We try to work with them to align their data policies, because the policy, what they recommend, how they recommended, the terms, etc., tend to be very different from publisher to publisher. And there is a strong interest within the publisher community to indeed work together. And Fair Sharing is working as a glue around the publisher. So to work to align that policy in relation to how they choose the repository, how they choose the standard, which are recommended to the authors to improve the data sharing policy. So that's an important step also to help consequently the researcher who publish with this publisher. And I'm only giving you a reference where we are actually live posting all the documents and this agreement as we release it. So this is my last slide. And to go back to my analogy with the road traffic, if you are in the UK, you will recognize that's called the Magic Roundabout, which is in Windsor near Oxford. So here I want to say that obviously we are at the moment where there's a little bit of chaos and so many groups are developing similar activity, but I'm pretty sure, I'm very confident that the high collaborative work in Europe, as in the US, as in Australia, as worldwide, through organizations like RDA and many other, we will come to a convergence in all these points, because at the moment it's not something simple to do, but it's no longer optional. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. for this enlightening presentation and lively. So I think that everybody has a better knowledge of the fair and all the work being done in different projects around fair, which is amazing for the moment. So now we are going to hear in a row 2 presentations, and I'm going to call first Matthew DiFranco. Matthew DiFranco was before his present activity the chair of the Marie Curie Alumni Association, and that means that he has had a huge amount of contacts and a personal experience as a researcher of the real world in which young researchers are actually sent or are growing when they start their career. And this is something which is important because they are the future of of science, and the way they are educated or the way they are evaluated, and the place where open science, that open science is occupying, is a key for the future. So please, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Anne, and I hope that everybody can hear me. Thank you again for organizing this session. Actually, just to clarify, when Anne approached me about this session, this was quite a while ago, and I was currently the chair of the MCAA, but my tenure expired at the end of March, and we have a new leadership, and so I'm actually speaking on my own behalf here. And I just want to say that the previous talks were extremely insightful and helpful to set the context of what we mean by data sharing and open data in the context of European research and open science. I think it's important to emphasize that researchers represent a profession, and that researchers from early career through to late stage to the emeritus professors are professionals. And when researchers engage in a PhD, they are seeking to acquire this status as a professional. And researchers is a very broad term, but they're extremely heterogeneous. My experience with the MCAA and in my own career is there is no one researcher, there is no one prototype. There's researchers from multiple countries, in multiple disciplines, in multiple fields of specific study. So it's really important to put that into context. And I think the reason I say that is the MCAA and partner organizations like Eurodoc and the Global Young Academy, the Young Academy of Europe, who are representing young or early career researchers, are very much engaged in promoting open science and promoting open access. And I think it's very important in that context that these principles, fair principles, open data, open science, become the standard, become the way that researchers interact with each other and are evaluated. So with that being said, that's kind of my opening. I just wanted to quickly go over some key takeaways from my perspective in terms of what researchers experience in terms of data sharing and what they see as positives and negatives. And I have to say that because of the crisis, the COVID crisis, this didn't work out as planned, where there would be a survey and whatnot, but I try and summarize my own personal experience. So very quickly, data sharing can mean anything for a researcher, from sharing data with somebody they work with in their lab or in their research group who sits next to them or shares a lab with them, or within their own department or institution. It could also mean sharing external data or sharing data externally in a local or regional setting with partner institutions, in a national setting or an international setting. And of course, we've spoken about it here, and I think this is very much where things are going. The idea of public sharing via repositories and other methods where data is openly shared with the entire community. And I won't get too much into the details because that's already been covered. So broadly speaking, for ECRs, the benefits of data sharing include the the increased potential for successful collaborations. And more, this is extremely important for ECRs, especially at the European level, when we talk about ERC grantees, when we talk about Marie Curie grantees. This is built into the system, and this is something that the European funding mechanisms are clearly promoting. It also leads to a higher chance for some of being involved in a publication. If their data is being shared with other researchers, it's more likely that they will be published. And as I said before, researchers are very heterogeneous. We can't assume that every researcher wants or supports open data or open science. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because they have to work in their careers and promote their careers within the current context. Opportunities for informal peer review of data and methods. Oftentimes researchers, especially young researchers, don't get the feedback they need from their immediate supervisors or their immediate collaborators or peers. And sometimes simply sharing data with collaborators outside of their institution is a real benefit for them in terms of boosting their own morale and their own skills. There's also the obvious increased scope of scientific outcomes. We see this now with COVID, where data is being shared globally, but this happens on many other levels. And it's often the case that it's only possible to come to certain scientific outcomes with data from multiple sites through sharing, especially in medicine, which is where I actually currently work. And I know some of our panelists do as well. And also to make comparisons of methods on data from multiple sites. This is extremely important in the context of, for instance, deep learning, which has taken over computer science and many other fields. It's important to be able to verify methods on different data sets. And you often can't really publish your own method without having a data set to compare it with. And also to establish standards of reference in particular research topic. For large methodologies or competing methodologies, it's often much more advantageous for the entire research community to establish a standard of reference through data sharing, where everybody agrees if you want a methodology to be validated, it has to work or perform well on this standard. Of course, there's drawbacks for data sharing, and there are real drawbacks, and we shouldn't diminish them, even though we might not agree on the idea of closed data. People have, especially young researchers, have real concerns about their careers. That includes the risk of losing publishing opportunities. They would have less chance of being first to publish a new finding. And we know that there is this idea of being scooped, and there's the idea of being the first to publish, as Robert Jan Smits alluded to. The current evaluation system still rewards those who publish first and those who published in the best journals, quote unquote. And also the potential for their role to be minimized in a publication if they share. It's a natural, I guess, reaction to think if I keep it for myself, I will get all the credit. There's also the potential for slowing down progress when relying on external partners. I've personally seen this in my own experience from the earliest days of doing research all the way through to my last engagement in the academic setting. And of course, the potential for mistreatment by external partners. And this goes right to the concept of integrity, research integrity. So certainly, if you share your data, you have to rely on and trust partners to not misuse it and not to make improper claims on the data which you share. So I just want to quickly summarize the takeaways for ECRs in terms of data sharing. It depends, their experience depends very much on their field of study, the type of research, and the rules and regulations regarding the specific data, as well as the policy and preferences of supervisors, institutions, and funders. Again, research and researchers are very heterogeneous, and no one researcher has the same experience. But I do feel it's important to stress that it ultimately depends on the individual, and they should be empowered to decide if and how they choose to engage in data sharing, and it should be encouraged. And of course, for ECRs, the impact on their career is a driving force, both positive and negative, because in the current landscape, although we strive for open data and open science, we have to acknowledge that researchers are still impacted today by the policies that are in place today. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for this landscape from the point of view of early career researchers. And now I'm calling our last speaker, Koen Vermeer, who is from the CNRS in France, but he will talk with the view of the Global Young Academy, so not only European, but globally. And that will maybe lead to have different views on these aspects. Where do we stand there? So please, Koen, are you
Great.
ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne, for the introduction, and also to you and Moens for inviting me to this panel. I'm a research professor, as Anne said, at CNRS and the University of Paris, and I have a background in the natural sciences as well as the humanities and the social sciences, and I think that's useful different perspectives to what we are talking about right now. I'm also editor-in-chief of a journal, which gives me, again, a different perspective on the open science debate. And I have become, in a way, quite by accident maybe, but also out of interest, an expert on open science. I was a member of the Open Science Policy Platform of the Commission. I'm part of numerous working groups like of the ALEA, the European Academies. I'm on a task force of Coalition S, and so forth. I'm not going to enumerate all these credentials, but just to say that I'm very interested in open science and open data also. Most importantly, I'm the former co-chair of the Global Young Academy, and Anne and Moens asked me to give the Global Young Academy perspective on open data. And so let me just say 2 words about the Global Young Academy, or GYA itself, because I think it's relevant, because it's this perspective that I will be representing here. The GYA is a global academy of 200 members, and it's a recognized academy. It's a member of the Inter-Academy Partnership and the International Science Council, and we select our members based on research excellence and very importantly, their commitment to service. And just if there's any great young scientists in the room, we have our membership call open right now, deadline 15 September. So do have a look on our website and apply to become a member. That would be great. It will really help the open science community if you become a member, because you will get lots of opportunities to work on open science and open data. Now, what I want to talk about today, inspired by Anne's questions, is to go beyond the rhetoric of open data and to really look what is happening right now globally for young scientists. Is there a discrepancy between the policy that is promoting open science and open data and the reality? And my method is basically that I discussed this with a sample of members of the Global Young Academy. So I didn't do a formal survey, it was informal interviews, because I really wanted to get some qualitative insights and experiential reports. I think it's helpful because it gives you like not the polished responses you sometimes get in surveys or in when younger scholars talk to seniors, but a more rawer perspective based on interactions between ourselves. And my aim is to answer 5 different questions. And the first one is whether sharing data is beneficial to the career of a young scholar. And interestingly, the answer was a big yes. I think there was only 1 or 2 who said no. And I think that's very good news. The main reasons for that came up is that it's, well, first of all, sometimes it's just necessary you need the open data to get the research done these days, but it also really advances the research of the young scholars. The research itself, but of course also other benefits directly connected with how we do research, especially developing collaborations, but also tackling the reproducibility crisis. So the increased trust coming from the transparency from open data is really seen as an interesting benefit. Of course, there is faster exchange of data, faster learning. We've seen that, as has been mentioned before, in the context of COVID. But interestingly also, open data can be really good in the context of a pandemic, even for researchers who are not into medicine, because they're basically sitting at home, having no access to sometimes their laboratories or no access to the field, basically the areas in which they do field work. And so open data is really a way to continue doing research from home if people are quarantined and basically otherwise would be shut out of their own research projects. Now, do young researchers get credit for sharing their data? And there, interestingly, again, I mean, this was really unanimous. Everyone said no. And I think that is very important to realize that this is really a big issue that we need to tackle. I think that is really recognized by everyone. But the stories I've heard are actually quite telling and touching, up to people being fighting with their PIs and lab directors about whether or not the data can be shared. Even if they collected that data, they're often not allowed to share it. And people really getting into a fight with their superiors because they're being accused of stealing the data and giving it away to other people. So we really need to be aware of what is happening on the floor and how this is affecting even the relationships between researchers in the laboratory, and also the hierarchies and the difference between younger scholars and more senior scholars becomes very important here. It's also something that was an interesting remark, is that the better the data, the more integrated it is, but also the more difficult it will be to give credit for contributing to the data. Because it's different if every little chunk is identified, so to speak, it's easier, but if the data is really well integrated, it may become harder to find appropriate ways to give credit to everyone. Now, a third question is about whether there are other incentives to share the data. And our members were saying that there is basically no positive incentives apart from doing the research itself. There's only some indirect incentives that I think we have been talking about already to some extent. For instance, maybe more citations for the article, maybe more impact, maybe someone citing the data. But actually, we're facing a big problem here because there is no established practice for citing data. And so interesting stories that came up is that people saying like, well, my data were cited very sloppily, just as personal communication and not really making a reference to the data. And that was seen as sufficient by their peers. And sometimes also people say, well, when people cite data, they cite kind of an access number from a repository, but not my publication anymore. So this is leading to lower citations than if I wouldn't have done open data. So I think this points to important actions that we need to take as a community. We need to develop disciplinary norms around the citation, the correct citation of data. And another action I think that is important is to have more institutional encouragement so that people can learn about the opportunities that sharing the data gives us. There are, however, other kinds of incentives, negative incentives if you want to, which means explicit obligations to share your data. And more universities, journals, and funding bodies now require open data. And Robert Jan has been mentioning the funding bodies and the kind of power they have to require open data right now. Now, what is happening on a global scale is that it's very much dependent on geography, very much dependent on disciplines, how far developed this. In some fields, it's very elaborate. In some, for instance, just saying an example, in genomics, for instance, it's very advanced in the way data should be shared. There are very concrete obligations, but in other fields, that's not at all the case. So again, we need much clearer standards around how and why data needs to be shared. And again, I think also while it may be necessary to have these obligations, I think we really need to work on also positive incentives to keep the motivation of our researchers alive and really make them passionate about open data and really make them recognize the value of sharing. Right now it's seen as open data is good for the field, but not necessarily for the individual. And I think that is a shame if we want to go forward. The fourth question is, what are the obstacles to sharing data? And some responses are to be expected, I think, and Matthew talked about some of them. Obviously, a big one is opportunity loss. Sharing data right away would mean that you cannot make all the publications out of it than otherwise. And people felt that a potential solution that is already being applied is to create some kind of restricted access mechanisms or embargoes for opening up the data. For instance, only sharing the data upon written request. And the advantage that has is that it's clear who is asking for your data. And that means that you responsibilize people and you actually can start a concrete collaboration with someone instead of just having your data in a repository and not knowing who is actually interested in it and using it. But again, I think there is an action needed here for the community, and that is that people felt the strong need to formalize embargo periods, if any, but I think many feel that this is an answer to the problem of opportunity loss. And many also feel that embargoes may lead to increased share of data, because right now people are keeping the data because there is no agreed on structure of how to share it and how to protect also, at least for a limited time, the data that people are having. There are also legal and ethical obstacles, of course, that has been talked about, but maybe even more importantly, there is lack of clarity about the potential legal and ethical obstacles to sharing data. Some of our members talked about some data being very much protected, that it needs to be in a password protected computer in a locked office, and so forth. And they are not even allowed to reuse their own data for the next project. There's a lot of confusion actually about what exactly is allowed, how that also applies across geographical boundaries, because our researchers are very mobile, but there's different ethical rules and restrictions in different countries. So it's very hard actually to keep track of what is allowed in what context and what you can do with your previous data and your previous research. So again, an important action that is needed from the research community is to clarify these legal and ethical frameworks and to give more global information about these regional and national differences. So this comes to something that I'll briefly talk about at the end also, is the need for training and information. But I think specifically clarifying legal and ethical frameworks will be very important. A few quick points that were mentioned also to be obstacles to sharing the data. One is that sometimes the quality of the data is mixed and it's not always easy to fix it. I think that comes then back to what we've been talking about before about clear data management plans, but these are not all yet established, but I think there's great progress in that area. Another thing is informally that you want to protect your informants. You want to protect, if you're working like with qualitative data with humans, it's not always possible to anonymize them appropriately. And having data open creates a lot of extra work to make them fair. And it was felt as a real obstacle to our researchers, even though people also felt there was a benefit, because if you start reformatting your data according to the right principles so that it can actually be part of a bigger data set. You also learn how to work with these bigger data sets. So it opens then again new possibilities for working with other people's data. So there was kind of a benefit and obstacle at the same time. And then my final point is about, do young scholars get any training for sharing their data? And here again, very interestingly, an almost unanimous no. There is absolutely no training around, especially if you look at it from a global perspective. There's like one case at one of the really top universities said that there was some info around, but it was not presented in a user-friendly way. And I think that's also something important to think about. Training and information being out there is not enough. It needs to be accessible, not just in the sense that you can get it, but also that it's kind of you can process it for busy people who have lots of projects running, that they can get information that they need quickly and in a way that they can retain that information. So I think there's work to do on making information about open data more user-friendly for a larger community so that this can really be picked up by a large community of researchers. Mostly people learned about open data through informal mentoring by others, but they strongly feel that it should be part of graduate school curricula and potentially also for actually kind of retraining of older researchers, because if we have to wait for all the PhD students to become senior researchers, open data will have to wait for another 20 years, so to speak, before it becomes a reality. So we need also to retrain the senior researchers if we want to have more and quicker progress on open data. Finally, and I'm happy to say that our own members, because of this lack of training and information, they're actually creating their own training courses for inside their universities and inside their laboratories. And so, well, we have engaged members committed to service, as I said, and so that's one way that we show that, and so we make change from the floor and from in the laboratory, changing the practices. And I think, of course, it's an opportunity to collaborate between open data and the open education sectors of open science, as these go hand in hand. So thank you. That was a quick overview of responses, and so giving you a perspective, not a top-down, not a policy perspective on open data, but listening to people, what they think is happening and what the concerns are confronted with. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Koen, for this a nice insight into the reality. And now we have about 25 minutes, I think, to go with some questions and discussion with the audience. Of course, you can discuss between speakers, but I would like first to give you a reflection and a question from the audience, which came while you were talking. One is, should we move away from the model of being the first in the value of the research that we publish or that we do? So who wants to answer that? I think that Koen, that was in what you described, or Matthew. So I would like first to ask you to answer this question. Koen, you were the last speaker, and then Matthew.
Sure. Well, I think Matthew mentioned it, but I'm happy to answer the question also, and then I mean we can do it together, Matthew.
No problem.
My answer would be yes and no. I see the point, and I think hyper competition is actually not beneficial to science. I think what we fail to recognize is that many of the big progresses are really built on a broad set of work that has been done by others that is less visible. I think like the metaphor of standing on the shoulders of giants and of others is really important here. So it would be great if we have a more refined way of assessing where novelty is actually happening and focusing less on like the one big article that makes the big discovery, so to speak. And then if people make big discoveries on data on others, obviously these others contributed enormously. I mean, these are actually the giants on which shoulders we stand also, and we shouldn't forget.
Matthew?
Yeah, I agree. The answer is yes and no, and it sounds very easy to say that, but I think everybody recognizes that, you know, research has heroes, and researchers, as they grow up in their profession, they need heroes. They need to know about these you know, big figures who have done big things. But behind the scenes, we know that it takes a large amount of people to make these things happen. And the problem is not necessarily the incentive to be first, but what we do with that and how we acknowledge it. I think there's been, I don't want to get into details, but there historically are cases where the people who should have been acknowledged were not acknowledged. And that's very damaging for researchers, for people in general, and their careers. And I think what we're trying to create an environment where recognition is given to the people involved. And maybe we need heroes, but we don't want to deify people too much, because sometimes the people who are given credit for making the first discovery don't turn out to be the right people to be leaders in research. And that's really important to understand as well. So
if I can add something to on this point, which is important, obviously, is I would like to take the point of view of the reproducibility. And nearly by definition, when you publish first, and that's the first time something is heard or published, it has not yet been reproduced, apart from what you can do within your own group, repeating
Exactly.
and so on. So how to value the the reproduction of research would be another way of looking at it, because what becomes solid is when it is reproduced. And there are a number of wonderful or interesting publications that then are not able to be reproduced, and then that can go up to retraction if they are not really reproducible at all, and it can be shown that they were not real in a way. So there is always the risk, being the first, not to do everything you could to solidify, I would say, your discovery. And it becomes, this solidification, it becomes true when somebody else independently is doing the same. So I don't know how this could be turned into the reality, but I think that something that becomes reproduced is the only way to say that it is reproducible, should be valued from both sides, the first one, but of course the one who dared to try to reproduce and to do it. I don't know if any one of the speakers want to
I think
on that.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And first of all, if you go to that question, I think it's more important being the best than being the first. I think that is much more important. And but to come back to your question, the reproducibility is of course a key issue of science. But there's hardly any funding agency which organizes a call on reproducibility, because that's not sexy enough, or that's not seen as something which you know want to dedicate public money to, and yet it is essential for science and to advance science. So I think you're rightly saying this should get more attention, and there should indeed funding agencies should organize calls to allow for reproducibility. I mean, that should be, I think, a very important activity of funding agency.
I do agree on that. And can you imagine, well, an important discovery, and then the funding agencies putting a call oriented on this, or maybe several of these discoveries, saying we are giving money to reproduce it. So it first gives a lot of pressure on the one who has published, because it's not a researcher somewhere in a corner trying to reproduce, and if it cannot, maybe it just remains not public. So that would probably increase the quality of the discoveries if nearly systematically, because the reproducibility is important, there would be a sort of tradition in funding agency to devote part of their funding to reproduce one or the other.
It could also lead to a situation that less papers are withdrawn. There are many, many papers withdrawn because indeed people discovered they made mistakes, or they were sloppy, or they were too eager to be the first instead of being the best. So no, I fully agree with you.
I also agree with, and I think, and it's a good idea that funding agencies should actually have, or Robert Jan, you mentioned it too, that they should have these kind of calls. I just wanted to highlight that I'm a history of science in my scholarly work, in my day-to-day job, so to speak. And the history of science also shows that reproduction of other experiments is often extremely difficult and complex. If it's really kind of cutting edge science at a limit of what instruments can do. I mean, this is going back really long time to the air pump experiments in the 17th century, like so just to say that we often think, well, to reproduce something, it's just kind of doing the same thing. What can be easier, so to speak, right? That's kind of a much too easy perspective on reproduction. Sometimes it's a very challenging and complex task that, of course, needs to be rewarded because it has its own ingenuity that comes to play.
And perhaps, and to come back to make the link again with data, there was a fascinating article, I think, a couple of years ago in one of the magazines, which shows that many of the scientific experiments could not be reproduced because the underlying data were not there anymore. And even companies, top-notch companies, pharma companies, had big problems to do reproducibility of experiments because also there, often the underlying data were not there anymore. So it brings us back to the topic about data and the importance of sharing data, interoperability, but also recognizing the people who work on data sharing, making data available, and making sure the data of high quality.
Thank you very much. And I think this goes directly to maybe a reaction from Susanna, because of course, the first thing is findable. That means that the data have to be there and they can be found. So how do you react to this reflection, Susanna?
Well, I'll say that simply, like I say in my presentation, FAIR, it's hopefully giving a second life to an important topic which we have dealt for years: data management, data storage, data reuse. And I think we have seen that some changes, at least from the funders, in order to start funding more tools, start going into more in the direction of funding infrastructure as service for data sharing, for data management, which, to be truly honest, like I say, in 20 years of my career, I've struggled to get the right money. I had to add a lot of small grants because the amount of grant you get in research data management was very little. It's increased. I don't think we are still there. I think we definitely need more investment from the funders into the tooling, into the infrastructure, which is essential to drive science forward.
Thank you very much. There is another reflection from the audience that say, are there any reasons why sharing should be anonymous? And that is in reaction to the fact that written request by an identified individual for accessing data can be something positive. And so the question is there any point in making it anonymous?
So I guess the question is also that, I mean, all these databases that collect the data, so to speak, could really require everyone who looks at that data to be recorded and to be identified, right?
And I can extend that to Suzanne. Actually, I was thinking while reading this question, you insisted on the machine reading and finding data and metadata, and in order that, it can be really valued and used. So how do you see this transformation in machine things, I would say, as compared to this direct and collaborative relations between the researchers? How do you combine these both aspects, which are both important?
Absolutely, both important, and we will have both type of science where you do things manually, you do things automatically, but everybody now use machine learning like a black box in most of the cases. But machine learning is based on the fact that you want to use the machine, use the data with minimal human intervention, and define the pattern, and make prediction. But you want to have the confidence that the machine does the right thing. So in my opinion, the cleanness of data, the trustworthiness of the data at the source, it's essential for machine learning, artificial intelligence, and any other, agent-driven science. But this doesn't mean that, we still have to do something manually, and some sciences or no science, they're also using data more, like I said, at low level, low tech, and manually. I think we need both.
Okay, thank you. Anyone wanted to react to this? Machine versus humans, and how to optimize this aspect? Well, I think
the machine type, of course, the machine type dimension cannot be stopped. I mean, that is where that will only increase. But I still think that those who generate data, who put a lot of effort into collecting data and are willing to share them, should get some recognition and should be also given some credit, instead of just people who are anonymously asking for the data and then do whatever they want with it. So I think there should be some kind of a link, and that then also will allow within the science community to give greater recognition for the people who take care of the data.
Yeah, it's a kind of a traceability of the use.
Absolutely.
Of data that has to be put in place, and there are some initiatives, but it should be globally applicable.
Actually, that's.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay, Susanna, and then Matthew.
Okay.
I mean, if we talk about careers and career progression and grants, as a scientist, you put some data out. You want to be able to say how much has been used. And actually, it's very hard to measure the reuse of your data in this moment. And when you report to your funder at the end of the grant, or you apply for a new grant to say has been successful because these people have used, these people have built on my data, that's what you need. So you need the traceability, absolutely. It isn't just the credit, it's the traceability you need to then get the next grant or the next fund to build on it yourself.
Yeah. Matthew?
No, I just wanted to say that this idea of traceability is quite important for recognizing the source of data, but also I think for validating it when used in other contexts, especially medical data, for privacy reasons, for safety reasons. I mean, in my current profession, I work in this type of area, validating models from machine learning, using data from different sources. And when I think about it now, it's a huge challenge from the perspective of data provenance and safety and risk for the medical use of data to build decision support systems, for instance. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. If I can add on this, some years ago, I was working on an international initiative called BRIEF, and that was Bioresource Research Impact Factor. And it was the idea was it was about, as you talk about human data and the medical data, it was about biomedical samples, biological samples, and the data attached. And in many cases, well, first of all, they have to be found and accessible and shared with protection of the individuals, of course. But then it is incredibly difficult to know which collection has been used and when. So we worked and together with editors and publishers, and you were alluding to them, Suzanne, in your talk. On a way of citing the resources used. It's not necessarily data, it can be samples, but there are the resources that are used in articles. And we came out with a standard or a guideline, at least, to cite the resources used in a given paper with a different way of, and that was machine readable, making the difference between a resource that you cite because it's necessary to cite it in your domain, and the resource that you have actually used in the paper that you publish. There was a system in the way of referencing that was making the difference between the two, and this can then be traced. So it has not been come in use, but that's a way to start finding ways of having this traceability of the use. It's just an example.
I totally agree with you, because here we don't talk just about data set. We need to talk about all the other digital objects, the software, the physical resources, as well as any other digital resource, the code, the standards, anything. Because I take the example, there are people like me building software, building methods. I don't necessarily produce data set per se. And again, I'm a researcher, I'm an academic, those are a research output considered. So absolutely, all of these need to be traced and cited. Obviously, standard get defined, there is a big step between defining the standard and get them accepted, especially get them into the workflow of the publisher. I work with several of them. I'm also the founding editor of Scientific Data, Open Access from Spring and Nature. And it's focused on citing things and getting these practices in action into, a journal in-house with all the technology they have to change is not trivial. So I think we need to be patient, and we need to spend the time, not just to develop this standard, but to get them, implement them.
Absolutely. And I think we still have some minutes so we can discuss. I don't see any new question coming from the audience. Don't hesitate, audience, to send questions. I look to them. But what I would like to say is, in reaction to both talks by Koen and Matthew, where you were talking about the risk of losing opportunities to publish if you share too quickly. And my reaction is, usually what you build on fear is not solid. That's very philosophical and general. But I think that what is behind this is actually, you can't say it. If you are, somebody is publishing something you have thought of, or you can't say it, because what is the value of saying, oh, I had thought of that, but somebody else has done the experiment more quickly? It has no value. You didn't even do not dare to say it because of your credibility, or I don't know what. So I think that's thinking of what you can talk about, and how different things are heard apart from a peer review publication are very important. If you freeze a speech, you solve part of that problem. So I think that in educating, training the researchers, maybe the old researchers, but the new ones, it's important to have this idea that free speech, you can say something, you can write a commentary, you can do things, and that of course has to be heard also by editors and publishers, is very important, because that's really the life of science. And we all know that a good idea, there are 20 people in the world having the same good idea at the same time, and the one having the data to work on it, maybe it's just chance. And okay, it's good that it is done, but I think this reality of minds working on ideas all over the world on different topics, and coming back to the question, which was if we value less the fact of being the first, maybe we would have more and less fear from these researchers. And maybe by sharing, you achieve many more scientific achievements. And I want to report in some of the minutes that are still left before I ask all of you to have a final word. In the domain of patient cohorts And this is a domain where you put a lot of effort to get data year after year with the follow-up on patients. And there is an example from Alzheimer patients in a cohort in the US, where the promoters of this cohort, they started sharing right away. And this is in epidemiology, not the classical way of behaving. If there is one place where you don't share, of course, it was not the name and the identity of the patients, but the data. And this cohort has got a number of publications out of this data, which is amazing and probably much more than anything else in the world, and everybody is citing this cohort. So by sharing quickly and not having fear about, you can achieve something that you might not have achieved. Okay, so that was my final word before I thank all of you and the audience. But I would like, we have a 2 minutes, 30 seconds around. If you could in 30 seconds each give one final word after this session. So I will start with you, Robert-Jan.
Well, I think it shows how much work we still have to do. And it's more than just making data fair. And I admire all the work that's being put into it. It's more than all the work of the Research Data Alliance. It's a cultural change into the science community. It has to do with new metrics, new reward systems. So I think we're just scratching the surface, and it will take quite some time before we have this cultural change. But I'm optimistic. I think we're getting there. But again, it requires a lot of leadership and also bold positions from funding agencies in order to make sure that this change, this cultural change is happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Suzanne?
Very quickly on the overcoming the fear of data sharing. I come from the genomics community where, sharing data has been the norm for years, forever. I think it can be done and it has to be done just in the right way with the credit. So if you are afraid of sharing something which is incomplete, now a journal accept preprint, the preprint GitHub repository, Zenodo, where you have the timestamp, you have like a UI or citable identifier. There's a way to show that this is your work and you have done a certain time, and I think that's the right way of sharing it.
Yeah, thank you. That's important. Matthew?
I think the topic, which I didn't talk about training of young researchers in data sharing, is actually extremely important. And the content of this talk, especially from Susanna and Robert-Jan Smith, I think getting that content and what's actually happening on the ground and what is possible today in terms of FAIR principles, what's happening at the EU level, if young research organizations can somehow deliver that message to as many people as possible and teach them and train them and encourage it, I think this would be a huge benefit going forward for researchers and research.
Thank you very much. And Koen, your last words?
Yes, thank you. And I loved what you said about not building on fear, and I agree with that. I think we need to take seriously the value of sharing. On the other hand, it's also a very personal thing. We need to be aware of the context of our researchers, and many of them don't even live in countries where free speech is possible, and they live in fear every day. And so just to add that we really need to continue listening to their concerns and not just in a way moralize it, but take their concerns seriously.
Thank you very much. Mogens, do you want to say one last word as you started the session?
Okay, so I think that the time is over, and I think it was a very nice discussion. So I just want to thank all the speakers and also Anne for moderating the session.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you very much.
You have to leave the room now by clicking on leave the room.
Thank you, Anne.
Bye-bye, and thank you again.